Russia's invasion of Ukraine has triggered a global surge in food and fuel prices. It has driven up the cost of living, triggered inflation across countries, and now the latest International Monetary Fund report says that the economic spillover of the Russia-Ukraine war may likely result in social unrest in Africa. Africa is among the world's most vulnerable regions. Many of the countries in the sub-Saharan Africa region are already witnessing an economic slowdown due to the COVID-19 pandemic. There is widespread poverty, economic inequality, and a food crisis that will be amplified by the Ukraine war. The IMF highlights that around 40% of consumer spending in Africa accounts for food, a number that is rapidly on the rise. The region imports around 85% of its wheat supplies for many countries, in fact, in the continent, near 40% of the calorie intake coming from these imports. Moreover, a highly priced fuel will affect domestic production as well. Note here that majority of African countries are not oil or gas producers. They import their fuel. Speaking of which, the head of IMF's African department has said that fuel price increases feed into transportation costs, and people providing goods and services will raise their prices because they are now facing higher input costs. And together, these factors will disproportionately hurt the country's poor. It will increase food insecurity, which the IMF officials say will be a shock that hits in a laser light directed at the poorest. Now, this is not the first time, of course, that Africa is looking at food riots. Similar food riots broke out in the continent in 2008, when the last major food crisis erupted. But back then, Africa had many more governments. Their finances were comparatively better for the countries to absorb the shock of the rising prices. This time around, the public debt is far greater in many parts, which would give a room for maneuver, and that is now a lot more diminished. The International Monetary Fund has now called for global support to help Africa persevere through the crisis. Recently, the IMF issued a joint statement with the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and the United Nations Food Programme, where they called for emergency food supplies, financial support, as well as increased agricultural production and unhindered trade, among other measures. We are now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.